All right, so today we're going down a pretty dark path with
Yeah.
this deep dive as we explore the case of Richard Lewis Hunter,
Hmm.
an Atlanta serial killer from the 1980s.
Okay.
You've asked to learn more about this case,
Right.
and we've got a whole bunch of different sources to pull from, court records, newspaper articles,
Yeah.
the whole bit.
The whole 9 yards.
Yeah, and it's a grim story,
For sure.
but we're here to understand it, not just to kind of rehash all the headlines.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, I think,
Yeah.
because, these weren't just cases in a file.
Yeah.
These were real people
Exactly.
whose lives were cut short.
Yeah.
Families were left with just unimaginable grief and a whole city gripped by fear.
It's true, and it's easy to get lost in the sensationalism of these cases, but that's not what we're going to do here.
Right.
We're really going to focus on the impact that this had on Atlanta back then.
For sure.
So picture this, okay?
Oh.
It's early 1986 in Atlanta. The city is bustling, but there's this growing unease
Yeah.
because over just a few weeks, several elderly Black women are found murdered in their homes.
And what's so chilling about this is that they weren't, just random targets.
Right.
You had Annie Copeland, Aretha Clemens, Dina Mime Mike.
Yeah.
They were all living alone.
Right.
They were relying on Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
And that made them particularly vulnerable, not just because they were alone, but also because they might have been, seen as less likely to report minor thefts or things like that.
Oh, interesting.
Which could have made them, targets for escalating crimes.
That's a good point. I hadn't considered that.
Yeah.
That it could have started smaller and then escalated.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, as more victims were discovered,
Yeah.
the similarities weren't just about, who they were, but also how it happened. And that must have been terrifying for investigators.
Absolutely.
On the public alike.
Imagine, you're finding these crime scenes,
Mm-hmm.
forced entry, signs of a struggle, homes ransacked.
Yeah.
And then this detail that really stood out,
What's that?
pillowcases,
Okay.
sometimes bloodstained,
Oh, wow.
left on or near the victims' bodies.
Okay, now that sends chills down my spine.
Yeah.
Those specifics, they make this real. It's
Wow.
not just some abstract true crime story,
Exactly.
Was there any sense of what the pillowcases meant?
Right.
Was it just random? Or was it something the killer did at each scene?
Well, that's where, criminal profiling comes in,
Okay.
which was actually a relatively new technique back then.
Oh, okay.
And the police weren't just looking at, demographics like age, race, location.
Right.
They were trying to understand the killer's behavior,
Yeah.
and those seemingly insignificant details like the pillowcases
Right.
could point to a ritual or a signature,
Interesting.
something that helps to narrow down the pool of suspects.
So as awful as it is, these details help to paint a picture. Right. But meanwhile, Atlanta is living through this nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
What was the mood like in the city at the time?
I mean, panic is an understatement.
Yeah.
You have to remember Atlanta was still reeling from the child murders just a few years prior.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so this new string of killings just reopened those wounds,
Wow.
triggered a collective trauma.
Oh, yeah.
The media was in a frenzy.
Mm-hmm.
You had politicians like Governor Joe Frank Harris offering rewards,
Right.
and community leaders were demanding action.
It's almost like the city was holding its breath, waiting for the next development. And tragically, it came on April 9th with the discovery of 65-year-old Grace Hill.
Yeah, her case marked a turning point.
Okay.
Not only was she found partially naked,
Oh, wow.
but there were also signs of a possible sexual assault.
So it just keeps getting worse.
It does, and this is when the police officially declared they were dealing with a serial killer.
Oh, gosh.
A terrifying escalation for
Yeah.
everyone involved.
And the pressure must have been immense to catch this person.
Oh.
Did the profiler's insights help at all?
Well, the profiler's work, while often criticized for being too vague,
Right.
did provide some direction.
Okay.
They suggested that the killer was likely a Black male in his 30s,
Okay.
living near the victims,
Mm-hmm.
and possibly with a history of abuse,
Okay.
perhaps even directing rage towards older women.
Interesting.
Now, those details might seem broad,
Yeah.
but when you're dealing with limited information,
Yeah.
any potential lead is worth pursuing.
Right. So it's like, you're starting with this giant haystack.
Yeah,
And you're trying to narrow down the possibilities.
exactly.
And incredibly, in this case, it was an anonymous tip
Mhm.
that broke the case wide open.
And that speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Someone, somewhere, knew something,
Right.
maybe a detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but they had the courage to speak up.
That's huge.
It is. And that tip led them to Richard Lewis Hunter,
Okay.
a 31-year-old man who fit the profile. He was a convicted forger living in the neighborhood with his girlfriend and children, right in the heart of where these murders were happening.
Okay, so now we're zeroing in on our suspect.
Yeah.
It sounds like the pieces are starting to fall into place.
Yes, but the investigation was far from over.
Right.
Hunter's initial arrest was for a probation violation.
Oh, okay.
While he was in custody, things really started to heat up.
Now this is where it gets interesting, right?
Yeah.
What were the police finding that linked Hunter to the murders?
Well, officials were really tight-lipped about specific evidence.
Okay.
But there were leaks from an anonymous source that pointed to strong fingerprint evidence,
Oh, wow.
linking Hunter to the crime scenes.
Okay.
On top of that, rumors were swirling that Hunter had tried to sell a TV set that belonged to one of the victims.
Whoa. Okay, so that's a pretty damning combination. Fingerprints at multiple scenes and trying to fence stolen goods. Sounds like the net was closing in fast.
Absolutely. And with the mounting evidence and the specter of the death penalty looming large,
Right.
Hunter had a major decision to make.
All right, I think we all know where this is heading,
Yeah.
but we're going to unpack all that in part 2.
Okay.
This is where we leave you hanging for just a bit.
Sounds good.
We'll be back in a flash to dive into Hunter's plea deal and the aftermath of these chilling crimes.
Looking forward to it.
So until then, what stands out to you so far?
Yeah.
Are there details that surprise you or maybe connect to something you've read or heard about other cases?
Right.
Keep those thoughts in mind as we delve deeper into the story.
For sure.
All right, so we're back and ready to dive into this next chapter of this really heavy case. We left off with Richard Louis Hunter
Right.
facing that mounting evidence
Yeah.
and that looming possibility of the death penalty.
Yeah, imagine yourself in Hunter's position for a second. You know,
Yeah.
the walls are closing in,
Yeah.
the evidence is stacking up. You're staring down the ultimate punishment.
Yeah, it's a pressure cooker.
It is. It's a total pressure cooker. And for Hunter, it led him to make a deal.
So he took a plea deal then
Exactly.
to avoid the death penalty.
Precisely. Faced with that overwhelming evidence
Right.
and the very real potential for execution,
Yeah.
Hunter chose to confess to the murders
Yeah.
of Annie Copeland, Aretha Clements, Danelle Iamike, and Grace Hill.
Wow.
It was a move that shocked a lot of people,
Yeah, I bet.
but it also brought a chilling sense of closure to the case.
Closure, but probably not justice, right? I mean, knowing that someone took the lives of your loved ones,
Right.
can a confession ever really bring peace?
That's a really profound question.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
For some, yeah, a confession might offer a sense of validation,
Okay.
confirmation that their suspicions were correct.
Right.
But for others, it might just reopen wounds,
Yeah.
force them to relive that trauma.
Yeah, it's a deeply personal experience.
It is.
And no two families are going to process it the same way.
Exactly.
And I imagine for the community, it was a mix of emotions, too.
Oh, for sure.
Relief that the terror was over, but also anger that someone could do something so horrific.
Of course.
So what was the reaction in Atlanta like after Hunter's plea deal?
Well, there was definitely a collective sigh of relief across the city.
Yeah, I can imagine.
People could finally breathe a little easier knowing that the killer was off the streets.
Yeah.
But as you pointed out, that relief was intertwined with anger
Yeah.
and sadness and just a profound sense of loss.
Of course.
These weren't just abstract cases. These were mothers, grandmothers, sisters, aunts,
Yeah.
you know, people who were woven into the fabric of their community.
So even though the case was technically closed,
Yeah,
the scars ran deep.
they did.
And that healing process was only just beginning.
For sure.
But before we get to the aftermath, I have to ask about the sentence. What did Hunter ultimately receive for taking those 4 lives?
He received 8 life sentences,
Wow.
plus an additional 80 years for the burglaries that were
Yeah.
committed along with the murders.
Jeez.
The district attorney at the time, Lewis Slayton,
Right.
made it clear that Hunter would have to serve at least 30 years
Wow.
before even being eligible for parole.
30 years before even a chance at parole.
Yeah.
That's a hefty sentence.
It is.
But I suppose when you consider the gravity of the crimes, it's hard to argue that it's not deserved.
Right.
Did the victims' families have any input
They
on the plea deal?
Yeah, the families were consulted throughout the process,
Okay.
and their voices were heard.
Good.
while no legal outcome can truly compensate for their loss.
Right.
The plea deal at least ensured that Hunter would be held accountable for his actions
Okay.
and wouldn't be able to harm anyone else.
And speaking of accountability, there's one loose end that we need to address. Throughout this whole ordeal, Hunter maintained that he didn't act alone.
Right.
He claimed to have an accomplice.
He did.
What do we know about that?
Well, this is where the case takes a very intriguing turn.
Okay.
Even in his confession, Hunter insisted that there was someone else involved in the murders.
Interesting.
Now, this could be interpreted in several ways.
Right.
Was he trying to deflect some of the blame?
Yeah.
Make himself seem less monstrous? Or was he telling the truth?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
Did the police ever find any evidence to support his claim?
That's the interesting part.
Okay.
The police conducted a thorough investigation, but they never found any credible evidence to corroborate Hunter's claims.
Whoa, okay.
They maintain that he acted alone.
Okay.
However,
yeah.
there are those who believe that there might be more to the story.
Okay.
That maybe the investigation missed something.
Right.
Or perhaps Hunter was protecting someone.
It's like a puzzle with a missing piece.
Yeah.
Even with a conviction. And a seemingly airtight case.
Right.
There's still this nagging question of whether someone else was involved.
Absolutely.
What was the public's reaction to this?
Yeah.
Did anyone believe him?
Public opinion was divided.
Okay.
Some people believed Hunter's claims.
Okay.
Pointing to the brutality of the crimes.
Right, yeah.
Speculating that it might have taken more than one person to carry them out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Others dismissed it as a desperate attempt to minimize his own responsibility.
Right.
Without any concrete evidence.
Yeah.
It became a matter of personal interpretation.
Okay.
Leaving a cloud of uncertainty hanging over the case.
It's fascinating.
It is.
And a little unsettling.
Yeah.
To think that there might be more to this story than we know.
Right.
So for you listening, I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Do you believe Hunter acted alone? Or is there a possibility that he had help?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
We've examined the facts, the evidence, the official narrative, but sometimes the human element, the search for the truth, can't be neatly wrapped up in a court case.
True.
There might be answers out there waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the mystery will remain unsolved.
Yeah.
Either way, this case offers a powerful reminder that justice, truth, and closure are complex, multifaceted concepts that can mean different things to different people.
And that's exactly what makes these deep dives so compelling.
It is.
We're not just rehashing old news.
Right.
We're exploring the nuances, the gray areas, the unanswered questions that linger long after the headlines fade.
For sure.
So stick with us, because in part 3, we're going to delve into the aftermath of these crimes and consider what this case means for you, the listener, today.
What lessons can we learn from this story?
Yeah.
How does it shape our understanding of crime, justice, and the human capacity for both good and evil?
All great questions.
We'll tackle these questions and more in our final installment.
Okay, so we've really unpacked a lot in this deep dive, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
We've walked through the chilling details of the case.
Right.
We explored the investigation and the trial, and we've grappled with this lingering question of Hunter's alleged accomplice.
For sure.
But as we wrap up, I want to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about the aftermath.
Yeah.
You know, what happened to Atlanta after Richard Lewis Hunter was behind bars?
Well, it's tempting to say that, this wave of relief washed over the city.
Right.
That life just went back to normal.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that's true.
Okay.
The immediate fear subsided.
Right.
People could sleep a little easier knowing that a serial killer wasn't roaming their streets.
Yeah.
But the reality is much more complicated.
Okay.
These crimes left an indelible mark on Atlanta.
So it wasn't just a matter of, locking up the bad guy and moving on. There were deeper, longer-lasting consequences.
Absolutely. Remember we talked about that collective trauma that Atlanta was already experiencing because of the child murders just a few years earlier? Well, these new killings just ripped open those wounds.
Oh.
It created this sense of vulnerability and fear
Yeah.
that permeated the entire city.
It's like one nightmare bled into another.
Yeah.
Leaving this sense of unease
Mm-hmm.
that's just really hard to shake off.
Right.
Did that fear manifest itself in any tangible ways?
Yeah.
Did people change their behavior?
They did.
Or were there any, like, community-wide initiatives put in place?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Okay.
The impact was both psychological and practical.
Okay.
People were more cautious, less trusting, especially the elderly,
Right.
who were hunters' primary targets.
Yeah.
Neighborhood watch groups became more active.
Okay.
And there was a big push for increased police patrols in certain areas.
So in a way, hunters' crimes had this, like, ripple effect.
Yeah.
Changing the very fabric of how people lived.
Right.
And interacted in Atlanta.
Absolutely.
It's a sobering reminder that even though justice was served, in the legal sense, the true cost of these crimes extended far beyond the courtroom.
Exactly. And while it's impossible to quantify that cost,
Right.
it's essential to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
The families of the victims continued to grieve, cope with the unimaginable loss they'd suffered.
Yeah.
The community, while relieved the killer was caught, had to grapple with the reality that such darkness could exist in their midst.
And then there's the lingering mystery of the accomplice.
Yeah.
That unanswered question must have added another layer of complexity
Not for sure.
to the healing process.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Imagine the families of the victims wondering if there was someone else out there who played a role in their loved one's death. Someone who might still be walking free.
Yeah, it's got to be unsettling.
It creates a sense of unease, a lack of complete closure.
Yeah.
And for the community as a whole, it raises questions about the thoroughness of the investigation.
Right.
The possibility that some threads were left untied.
It's a reminder that even with a conviction, even when the legal system runs its course, there can still be loose ends, unanswered questions that linger.
Absolutely.
In the minds of those affected.
For sure.
So for you listening, as we reflect on this case, what resonates with you the most?
Yeah.
Is it the chilling nature of the crimes, the impact on the community, or the enduring mystery of the accomplice?
It's a lot to process, isn't it?
It is.
And as you grapple with those questions, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay.
Richard Lewis Hunter's reign of terror ended decades ago. But his story continues to teach us valuable lessons about the nature of crime, the complexities of justice, and the resilience of the human spirit.
Beautifully said. We delve into these dark corners, not to glorify the perpetrators, but to learn, to understand.
Of course.
And ultimately, to find ways to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future.
Absolutely.
And perhaps, even more importantly, to remember and honor the victims.
Right.
Annie Copeland, Aretha Clements, Dina Mae Mike, Grace Hill.
Yeah.
They were more than just names in a case file.
That's right.
They were mothers, grandmothers, sisters, friends.
They were part of a community.
Yeah.
And their lives mattered.
That's a really powerful way to end this deep dive.
Thank you.
Remembering the victims, acknowledging their lives, and carrying their stories forward.
For sure.
So to you listening, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Yes, thank you.
We hope this exploration has sparked your curiosity, challenged your assumptions, and left you with a deeper understanding of this complex and tragic case. And as you move forward, we encourage you to continue exploring, to keep asking questions, to seek out different perspectives, because the pursuit of knowledge, the search for understanding,
it's a journey that never truly ends.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this one.
Thanks for having me.